Welcome, dearly beloved, anointed ones. Most disasters are polite first. They knock quietly before they kick the door in. Here's the part nobody prepares you for. The moment when everything collapses and someone looks at you like you just committed a crime because you already knew, not guessed, not hoped, knew. The room gets quiet, their face changes, and suddenly you're not comforting them. You're being stared at like a leaked document. There's an actual reason this happens. Studies on human perception show that people who've endured prolonged instability develop faster threat pattern recognition. Translation: when you've lived through enough chaos, your brain stops waiting for proof. It connects dots early, calmly, and without drama. That's not paranoia, that's data. And it's why some people feel blindsided by life while others are already emotionally unpacked before the suitcase hits the floor. What really messes with people isn't the situation itself. It's realizing the warning signs were there the whole time, and you saw them while they were busy posting motivational quotes and trusting vibes. You didn't need a crystal ball. You just noticed the tone shifts, the effort gaps, the weird delays, the forced optimism. Small things, boring things, the kind of things people ignore until they're crying in the kitchen at 2 a.m. And let's be honest, there's something darkly funny about being calm while everything is on fire. Not because you enjoy chaos, but because you already packed emotional snacks for the breakdown weeks ago. Everyone else is shocked. You're just tired. Not shocked, tired. There's a difference. This isn't about being psychic. It's about having a mind that learned, the hard way, to read what's coming before it arrives. While others were reacting, you were observing. While they were hoping, you were preparing. And now they're saying, dude, I'm not okay. How did you know this exact scenario was coming? Because some people don't wait for the storm to hit to understand the weather. Number one, you didn't predict the event. You predicted the pattern. People get this part wrong all the time. They think knowing what's coming means you saw the future like a movie trailer. That's not what happened. You didn't see the scene. You recognized the script. You've watched the same behaviors play out enough times to know how they end, even when the faces and locations change. When the same moves show up again, your mind doesn't panic or hope. It connects the dots and quietly finishes the sentence. Patterns don't announce themselves loudly. They show up as small repetitions people ignore, a shift in tone, a delay that doesn't make sense, someone suddenly defending things they never had to defend before, accountability getting fuzzy, effort becoming selective. These things look harmless to people who believe every situation is unique. You know better. Human behavior repeats itself far more than people want to admit. Your awareness comes from exposure, not arrogance. You've been in enough situations where things went left after the same early signs appeared. You remember the order. First the denial, then the justifications, then the emotional distance, and finally the fallout. So when you saw the beginning this time, your nervous system already knew the ending. Not because you wanted it to happen, but because you've already lived it. This is why you stayed calm, while others were still optimistic. Optimism needs comfort to survive. Pattern recognition doesn't. It runs on honesty. You didn't need reassurance, speeches, or promises because you weren't listening to words anymore. You were watching behavior line up exactly how it always does before things collapse. When the situation finally unfolded, people acted shocked, betrayed, confused. You didn't celebrate being right. You felt tired. Tired because you had already processed the outcome emotionally before it arrived. You had already adjusted your expectations while everyone else was still bargaining with reality. That's what unsettles people. Not that you knew, but that you weren't surprised. You didn't predict chaos. You recognized the warning signs of it finishing its work. And once you've seen that pattern enough times, it doesn't need permission to repeat itself. Number 2, your awareness comes from having lived 5 steps ahead just to survive. Some people learn to live in the moment because life was safe enough to do so. You didn't get that option. You learned early that being present without preparation came with consequences. So your mind adapted. While others relaxed, you stayed alert. While they assumed things would work out, you quietly calculated what would happen if they didn't. That wasn't anxiety. That was survival. Living 5 steps ahead doesn't mean you're always tense. It means your brain runs scenarios automatically. You notice exits. You sense mood changes. You catch when something feels off before it becomes a problem. This didn't come from overthinking. It came from experience teaching you that waiting for things to fall apart was dangerous. So you learned to anticipate. Over time, that anticipation became instinct. You didn't sit down and plan it. Your nervous system did it for you. When environments are unpredictable, the brain learns to forecast. It looks for patterns, timing, and inconsistencies. That's why you often know when something is about to shift before anyone says a word. You're not guessing. You're reading signals you've been trained to notice. This is also why sudden chaos doesn't shake you the way it shakes others. You've already been mentally there. When things go wrong, people freeze or spiral because they never prepared for that version of reality. You adjust quickly because your mind has already rehearsed the possibility. You're not calm because you don't care. You're calm because you've been here before. The downside is that people mistake your readiness for emotional distance. They think you're detached, cold, or pessimistic. They don't see the truth, that you learned to think ahead, because reacting late once cost you something you couldn't afford to lose. That lesson stayed with you. So when a situation unfolds exactly as you sensed it would, it's not magic. It's the result of a life that taught you to look ahead before you had the luxury of looking around. You weren't born cautious. You were trained by circumstances. And that training gave you an awareness most people don't develop until life forces it on them. Number 3, you noticed what everyone else refused to look at. Most people live in a filtered version of reality. They see what's convenient, what's flattering, what confirms their comfort. They ignore the small cracks, the quiet red flags, the tiny shifts in behavior that hint at something deeper. You didn't have that luxury. You couldn't. Life demanded that you pay attention to details others labeled insignificant, because missing them once had consequences you could never undo. That made your vision sharper. You started noticing things people didn't even think to see. The signs are always subtle. A hesitation in a smile, a pause in a story, a word repeated too often. Most people shrug and move on. You don't. You catalog every small inconsistency because over time, those small inconsistencies form a map of what's coming. The world tried to teach you that survival depended on seeing what others ignored, and it stuck. What feels like paranoia to them is precision to you. Because of that, when the scenario finally hit, others were blindsided. They reacted with shock, anger, or confusion because they had been living in denial. You weren't shocked. You weren't confused. You were simply observing the outcome of a process you'd already traced in your mind. That's what makes people uncomfortable. Not that you were right, but that you saw the truth while they were still pretending. Noticing what others refuse to see also separates you from false reassurance. People want easy answers, quick fixes, and comforting lies. You don't waste time with illusions. You see the effort gaps, the manipulations, the subtle shifts in power and attention, and you account for them before they even become problems. That kind of clarity isn't taught. It's forged through repeated exposure to the chaos most people ignore until it's too late. This is why your presence unnerves people. You operate in a world of truth that they aren't willing to confront. While they stumble blindly through situations, you navigate the same landscape with confidence, because you've already identified the cracks, mapped the trajectory, and understood the motives behind every move. You don't just see reality, you see the reality that everyone else refuses to acknowledge. Number 4, your intuition isn't loud, it's precise. Intuition gets misunderstood. Most people think it's a feeling that screams, a gut that twists until you act. That's not yours. Yours doesn't shout. It doesn't create drama. It whispers in a way that cuts through noise with surgical accuracy. You don't feel everything around you. You feel only what matters, the subtle currents that predict outcomes before anyone else notices. That's why your instincts rarely fail. The precision of your intuition comes from exposure and observation. You've seen patterns unfold enough times to know what small signs actually mean. That hesitation in a sentence, the micro-expression people try to hide, the way someone suddenly changes tone without reason. These aren't random, they're signals, and your brain reads them like a map. While others react emotionally and inconsistently, your intuition filters the chaos and points straight to what's coming. This precision also means you act differently than everyone else. You don't jump at every alarm. You don't assume every threat is real. You wait, analyze, confirm. When your intuition speaks, it's not a guess. It's a conclusion built on experience, observation, and careful pattern recognition. That's why people think you're uncanny or even psychic. They don't see the countless scenarios you've silently tracked in your head before the moment ever arrived. Because your intuition is precise, you see outcomes as they form. You don't just sense danger or opportunity, you sense the trajectory. You know when someone will fold under pressure, when loyalty will fracture, when truth will surface. And when the scenario finally plays out, you're ready. Others are startled. They scramble for answers. You already have them because your intuition doesn't lie. It doesn't exaggerate. It doesn't panic. The most unnerving part for everyone else is that this precision makes you appear untouchable, calm, even cold. You aren't cold. You're just attuned. You don't need the theatrics of emotion to validate what you know. You know it, and that knowledge carries you through chaos with clarity and confidence, while the rest are still trying to figure out what hit them. Number 5, you learn to read intention, not words. Most people listen to what's being said. They take promises, excuses, and reassurances at face value. You don't. You learned early that words are often armor, a way to hide true motives, and a tool people use to manipulate or control. What matters isn't what someone says. What matters is why they're saying it, and what they're trying to achieve in the spaces between the syllables. You see those spaces clearly. Learning to read intention isn't about being cynical. It's about paying attention to how actions align with words. You've watched people say one thing while doing the exact opposite. You've seen loyalty claimed in speeches, while betrayal is quietly enacted behind the scenes. Over time, this becomes a skill you rely on more than language itself. You start noticing subtleties that reveal truth, hesitation before a sentence, avoidance of certain topics, or overcompensation in promises. Those tiny cracks tell you more than anything spoken aloud. Because of this, manipulation doesn't catch you off guard. People assume you'll fall for flattery, guilt, or pressure tactics. You don't. You read the intention behind the words, and you adjust. You know when someone is trying to control the narrative, and you don't let it influence your decisions. You aren't reacting emotionally to what's said. You're responding logically to what's meant. That distinction makes you untouchable in situations where most people are blind. This ability also explains why people are often shocked when you respond perfectly to deception. They assume you were naive, unaware, or caught off guard. In reality, you already understood the motives long before they acted. You processed the implications and positioned yourself ahead of the fallout. Your skill of reading intention over words changes how you interact with the world. You no longer get pulled into empty promises or performative gestures. You navigate life by detecting the undercurrent of truth beneath the surface. That's why you could see exactly how this scenario would play out. You weren't guessing. You weren't lucky. You were observing, interpreting, and moving based on the intentions everyone else ignored. And that gave you an edge no one else saw coming. Number 6. You knew because the energy had already shifted weeks ago. Most people think they're surprised by events because they only see the moment something happens. You don't operate that way. You noticed the shift long before the chaos arrived. Energy doesn't lie. It changes subtly, slowly, almost imperceptibly. But for someone paying attention, the difference is impossible to ignore. The conversations that felt off, the effort that started to disappear, the hesitation in gestures, all of it was a signal. While others were distracted by the surface, you were tracking the undercurrent. This isn't about being dramatic or reading too much into nothing. It's about recognizing patterns in human behavior and the invisible weight of intentions. When someone is about to fracture, manipulate, or fail, the shift starts long before their words catch up. People don't suddenly change. They bend slowly, and the energy around them bends with them. You could feel it. It's why you weren't surprised when the scenario unfolded exactly as it did. You weren't psychic. You were attuned. Because you noticed this early, you had time to adjust. You weren't scrambling, panicking, or trying to rationalize what happened in the moment. You were already prepared mentally and emotionally. Others, on the other hand, walked in blind. They relied on what they were told, what they wanted to believe, or the appearances of normalcy. That gap between your perception and theirs is what makes your awareness feel almost untouchable. The unnerving part for everyone else is that you didn't even have to announce it. You didn't need to prove you were right. You simply observed and moved accordingly. The energy didn't lie, and neither did you. By the time people finally realized something was wrong, you had already processed it, positioned yourself, and understood the outcome. This is the kind of clarity most people never experience. They react, you anticipate. They panic, you observe. They are shocked, you already knew. And it's all because you recognized the shift in energy that everyone else refused to see weeks before it became undeniable. That's why the question, "How did you know?" doesn't bother you. You were never in doubt. Number 7, you saw the ending because you weren't emotionally invested in the illusion. Most people get caught off guard because they need things to be a certain way. They invest hope, time, and energy into outcomes that aren't guaranteed, and when reality collapses, they act surprised. You didn't operate like that. You've been through enough to understand that reality doesn't bend to desire. You saw the scenario unfold in your mind long before it actually did, because you weren't clinging to a comforting illusion. You were observing reality as it was, not as you wished it to be. Being emotionally detached in this way doesn't mean you don't care. It means you stopped bargaining with fantasy. While others were negotiating with hope, trying to convince themselves that people would act differently or events would align in their favor, you were processing the facts. You knew the signs, the patterns, the small inconsistencies that eventually spelled the outcome. You didn't need evidence to tell you what was coming. Your understanding wasn't emotional, it was analytical, grounded in observation and experience. Because you weren't invested in the illusion, you didn't panic when things went wrong. You didn't waste energy on denial, begging, or frustration. You simply adjusted, recalculated, and positioned yourself accordingly. That's why people around you are shocked when events spiral out of control. They expect chaos to surprise everyone equally, but they forget that someone who doesn't need the story to end differently sees it clearly from the start. This kind of emotional independence gives you an advantage that's almost unfair. You see outcomes forming, you notice manipulations before they take effect, and you can respond with precision rather than reaction. You don't scramble, you don't cry, you don't shout. You move, you observe, and you wait for the inevitable to reveal itself. The world struggles with illusions because most people mistake hope for security. You survived by distinguishing truth from comfort. That's why the ending didn't shock you. You were never blind, you weren't guessing. You simply understood that reality doesn't negotiate, and by the time everyone else realized the truth, you were already several steps ahead, calm and unshaken. Number 8, your mind automatically asks, what happens next? Most people live in the moment without considering the consequences beyond what they see right now. You don't. Your mind has been trained to operate several moves ahead, like a chessboard where every piece, every reaction, and every intention is already accounted for. While others are reacting emotionally to life as it comes, you are already calculating the next steps, predicting outcomes, and preparing responses. This isn't anxiety, it's instinct, forged from experience. From a young age, circumstances forced you to anticipate. You couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Every situation demanded that you think ahead, not just to succeed, but to survive. Over time, this became automatic. Your brain doesn't need to be told to assess, predict, or simulate scenarios, but it just does. You see a shift in tone, a subtle hesitation, or an unusual pause, and your mind immediately runs multiple timelines of what could follow. That's why when a situation unfolds, it rarely surprises you. You've already been there mentally. This constant forward thinking changes how you experience reality. You're not just observing events, you're tracking trajectories. You notice patterns in behavior, subtle shifts in energy, and gaps between words and actions. While most people are overwhelmed when chaos hits, you already know the likely outcomes: who will react, who will falter, and who will attempt to manipulate the situation. Your foresight gives you clarity that feels almost unnatural to those around you. Because your mind operates this way, your reactions are precise and measured. You don't overcommit emotionally, you don't panic, and you don't scramble for answers. You adjust strategically, like someone moving through a room where the exits and traps are already known. People see calmness and assume detachment, but it's not that. It's preparation. This ability to anticipate, to mentally live several steps ahead, is why you knew exactly how the scenario would unfold. You didn't guess. You didn't rely on luck. You weren't shocked. You were already at the ending in your mind, watching everyone else catch up while you were quietly ready for whatever came next. Number 9, you recognize the collapse before the conflict began. Most people think chaos arrives suddenly, like a lightning strike that leaves no warning. You know better. Collapse doesn't come out of nowhere. It whispers first, in the subtle shifts that most people dismiss: the uneven effort, the hidden tension, the passive-aggressive remarks, the micro changes in behavior that seem insignificant at first. These signals pile up until the inevitable conflict is unavoidable. You noticed all of them, and that's why when the storm hit, you weren't scrambling or panicked. You were already ahead. Recognizing collapse early is about observation and experience. You've seen enough relationships, projects, and situations fall apart to know the pattern. First comes denial, then excuses, then distance, and finally the breaking point. While everyone else waits for the loud confrontation to mark the beginning of trouble, you were already tracking the trajectory. You don't need the fight to start to know it's coming, because the prelude is written clearly in energy, behavior, and intention. This foresight gives you a unique kind of power. You can prepare mentally, emotionally, and strategically, while others are still caught in surprise. You've already processed the disappointment, anticipated the fallout, and positioned yourself to navigate it with precision. That's why people are often shocked by how composed you are during situations that crush everyone else. They see panic and reaction everywhere and assume that's normal, but you've been operating ahead of the curve all along. Noticing collapse before conflict also means you don't get manipulated by appearances. People try to mask their intentions, but you read the inconsistencies beneath the surface. You know when loyalty is performative, when effort is selective, and when control is being quietly asserted. By the time the confrontation arrives, you already understand the motives, the likely outcomes, and the emotional consequences. That's what sets you apart. You weren't caught off guard. You didn't wait for drama to confirm reality. You anticipated it, understood it, and navigated it before anyone else even realized the ground beneath them was cracking. You saw the collapse coming because you were paying attention to what everyone else refused to acknowledge, and that awareness kept you several steps ahead, while chaos consumed the rest. Number 10. You trusted your internal data over external reassurance. Most people live their lives believing what they're told, relying on reassurances from friends, family, or authority figures to feel safe. You don't. You learned early that the world often says what it wants you to believe, not what is actually true. So you stopped relying on voices outside yourself and started trusting the evidence within, your observations, your instincts, and your gut understanding of people and situations. That internal data became your compass, far more accurate than any comforting lie anyone could offer. This trust isn't arrogance, it's necessity. You've experienced the fallout when external reassurance failed, when words didn't match actions, when people who promised safety delivered betrayal instead. That left an imprint, the realization that other people's opinions are rarely reliable guides. Your mind and body became your most trusted sources of information. You learned to notice patterns, pick up subtle cues, and sense inconsistencies that others dismiss. That's why when the scenario unfolded exactly as it did, you weren't surprised. You had already processed it through your internal radar, while everyone else was still clinging to promises and reassurances. Relying on internal data also gave you a clarity most people never develop. You don't overreact to noise or hype because your own senses and reasoning provide a baseline of truth. You don't get swayed by temporary appearances or false confidence. Instead, you watch, record, and interpret, and then you act based on what you know is real. That's why manipulations, delays, or sudden shifts in behavior don't throw you off. You already accounted for them mentally. This ability separates you from the majority. People are constantly shocked by the outcomes you foresaw because they trusted the wrong sources. You didn't need anyone else to validate what you already knew. You had been quietly processing, calculating, and preparing while others were waiting for permission to see reality. When everyone else panics or feels blindsided, you stay grounded. That's because your guidance system is internal, precise, and uncompromising. You don't rely on comforting illusions. You rely on facts you've observed, instincts you've honed, and a mind trained to trust itself over the noise of the outside world. That's why they ask, "How did you know?" And you don't even need to answer. Number 11, you weren't shocked. You were disappointed it took this long. Most people experience life as a series of surprises, constantly reacting to events as if they appear out of nowhere. Not you. You've learned to read the patterns, the subtle warnings, and the gradual buildup of tension that signals inevitable outcomes. By the time the scenario finally arrived, you weren't shocked at all. You were disappointed that it took this long. You had seen the trajectory months, weeks, or even days in advance, and it had been obvious from the start how it would end. This kind of insight comes from experience, from observing the same mistakes, betrayals, or collapses over and over again. You notice the small things that others ignore, the slight evasions, the half-truths, the fading energy, the delayed responses. While people around you were busy hoping, negotiating, or pretending everything was fine, you had already processed the situation mentally and emotionally. You weren't holding on to illusions. You weren't bargaining with outcomes that wouldn't bend. You simply understood that this was coming, and that people would still be shocked when it did. The disappointment comes from knowing how avoidable it was. You've seen it play out before. You've watched the same behaviors lead to the same consequences countless times. You understand that human nature rarely changes, and yet people act surprised every single time. That realization is exhausting. It's why when the collapse happens, your reaction isn't panic, confusion, or despair. It's a quiet, almost weary acknowledgement. Finally, it caught up with them. Being able to experience disappointment instead of shock gives you a unique edge. You remain composed while others scramble. You observe instead of reacting. You prepare instead of panicking. That's why people are drawn to you in confusion, asking how you always seem to know. It's not luck, intuition, or magic. It's patience, observation, and understanding reality better than most people are willing to face. You weren't shocked because you were already ready, and you were disappointed because everyone else wasn't. Number 12. Your foresight comes from emotional honesty, not optimism. Most people mistake hope or optimism for foresight. They think seeing the future clearly means believing it will be good or expecting the best. That's not how you operate. Your foresight comes from emotional honesty, the unflinching ability to see things exactly as they are, without sugarcoating, without pretending, and without comforting yourself with lies. You don't need things to be a certain way to understand what's coming. You simply face the truth, and that honesty gives you a clarity others can't achieve. Emotional honesty means recognizing the real motives behind people's words, the consequences of actions, and the subtle signals that everyone else dismisses. While others cling to appearances, reassurances, or their own desires, you pay attention to the raw data, shifts in tone, small contradictions, repeated patterns. You're not swayed by what people say they mean, or by what they want you to see. You're grounded in the reality they try to hide, and that allows you to anticipate outcomes with accuracy that seems uncanny to others. This is why you see endings before they arrive. You don't need optimism to forecast the truth. You need the courage to look at reality without flinching. That's why manipulations, betrayals, or collapses rarely surprise you. You've already processed the trajectory and positioned yourself accordingly. While people around you are shocked or scrambling, you're observing, understanding, and preparing for what's inevitable. Emotional honesty also protects you from false hope. You don't waste energy convincing yourself that a situation will improve just because it's convenient or comforting. You accept the facts, no matter how inconvenient, and you act based on them. That's what makes your foresight so powerful. It isn't about wishing or hoping. It's about seeing clearly, understanding deeply, and responding wisely. People are often unsettled by your clarity because they confuse honesty with coldness or detachment. In reality, it's the exact opposite. Your emotional honesty allows you to navigate life with precision, calm, and awareness that most people never achieve. That's why you can see the scenario coming, understand it fully, and remain unshaken when it unfolds exactly as you already knew it would. Number 13, you didn't manifest this, you prepared for it. Most people think foresight or anticipation is some kind of mystical gift, as if you somehow called the situation into existence. That's not it. You didn't manifest what happened. You prepared for it. Life taught you early that waiting for the world to be convenient was dangerous. You learned to account for possibilities, to anticipate patterns, and to respond before things could spiral out of control. Preparation, not prediction, is what gave you the advantage. Preparation isn't passive. It's active, relentless, and sometimes exhausting. It means observing details that others ignore, noticing inconsistencies that seem minor, and running scenarios in your head over and over until you understand the likely outcomes. You didn't need a dramatic revelation or a psychic moment. You had experience, awareness, and the mental discipline to map the trajectory of events before they unfolded. That's why, when it happened, the chaos didn't shock you. You were already several moves ahead. This preparation also explains why your reactions seem so calm and precise to others. People panic, scramble, and act impulsively because they weren't ready. You didn't need to react. You had already processed what would happen and positioned yourself accordingly. You anticipated the variables, accounted for motives, and stayed emotionally intact because you prepared for the reality, not the fantasy. The world mistakes this kind of readiness for detachment or even luck. They assume you were fortunate or gifted. In reality, what looks like intuition is actually the product of careful observation, experience, and disciplined anticipation. You didn't wait for life to surprise you. You treated life like a problem to solve, a system to understand, and a scenario to navigate. By the time everyone else realizes what's happening, you're already ready. You've already processed the outcome, adjusted your position, and accepted the truth. That's why people ask, how did you know? The answer isn't magic. It's preparation, honed through experience, sharpened by necessity, and executed with precision. You didn't manifest the chaos. You survived it because you were prepared. Number 14. The reason they're not okay is because they ignored what you accepted early. Most people react to events in real time, scrambling to process what they didn't see coming. You didn't operate that way. You accepted the reality of the situation long before it reached its peak. You didn't hope it would be different. You didn't negotiate with the outcome. And you didn't cling to illusions. You observed, analyzed, and came to terms with the truth before it fully manifested. And that's why when everything fell apart, you weren't shaken. This acceptance isn't passive. It's a conscious recognition of what is and what will be. You noticed the warning signs, the subtle shifts, and the repeated patterns, and instead of pretending they didn't exist, you acknowledged them. You processed the emotional and practical implications in advance, which gave you the ability to stay composed while everyone around you was still grasping for answers. They weren't ready because they refused to see what was already in plain sight. Because you accepted the situation early, you were able to navigate it strategically. You didn't waste energy on denial, anger, or panic. You didn't try to fix the impossible or control what was beyond your reach. You were prepared emotionally and mentally for the fallout, which allowed you to respond with clarity and precision. Meanwhile, everyone else was blindsided because they ignored the signals you had long since incorporated into your understanding. This is why your presence during these moments is unsettling to others. They expect surprise, confusion, and emotional chaos to be universal. It isn't. You're calm, focused, and already several steps ahead because you processed the reality that they were too afraid, stubborn, or distracted to confront. They're not okay because they were still bargaining with illusions while you were already grounded in truth. By accepting what others could not, you turned an unpredictable, stressful situation into something manageable. You didn't need to react impulsively or scramble for solutions. You were ready. They were not. That gap between their unpreparedness and your early acceptance is what separates you from them and leaves them asking, often in disbelief, how you were able to stay unshaken while their world fell apart. Every moment we've explored here points to the same undeniable truth. What sets you apart isn't luck, charisma, or even mystical insight. It's the relentless clarity, preparation, and emotional honesty you've developed through experience. You see the world differently because you pay attention to the things others ignore. You notice patterns, read intentions, track subtle energy shifts, and process reality long before it hits. While everyone else is caught in shock, chaos, or denial, you're already several steps ahead. You don't hope for the best. You don't wait for luck or for someone else to explain what's happening. You prepare, you observe, you adapt, you accept. That's why when the scenario unfolds exactly as you anticipated, your response isn't panic, confusion, or despair. It's calm, strategic, and unshakable. This awareness doesn't come from wishing or imagining. It comes from surviving, learning, and choosing to see the truth even when it's uncomfortable. It comes from trusting your own internal guidance instead of relying on external reassurances, and from understanding that outcomes aren't magical. They're predictable if you've learned how to read the signals. By mastering this approach, you've created a perspective that's nearly impossible to surprise, nearly impossible to destabilize, and uniquely powerful. People around you may be caught off guard, flustered, or even panicked, but you move with a quiet authority that comes from knowing the patterns before they manifest. The lesson is simple, but profound. Life's chaos doesn't intimidate you because you've already lived through its echoes, observed its warnings, and accepted its truth. You operate in a space where most people are blind. You anticipate, you endure, and you rise above the shock that breaks everyone else. That's the power of foresight grounded in honesty, preparation, and awareness. That's why they ask, "How did you know?" And the truth is, you never didn't. If this resonated with you, make sure you subscribe to the channel to stay connected with insights like these. Like the video, if it hit home, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep this conversation alive. Your awareness is your advantage, and together we're mastering the art of seeing clearly before the world catches up. God bless you.